Okay, it is 1 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. If you are tuning in live, go ahead and drop some comments. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Likely the great state of Texas, but I'm sure we have some folks from around the country as well interested in what's going on in Texas. Well, it is an exciting time to be an advocate for marijuana law reform wherever you live, but especially here in Texas. The pre-filing period began on Monday, and while our legislative session doesn't begin until January 12th, lawmakers are already introducing legislation. And we've seen over a dozen cannabis-related bills filed already, ranging from decriminalization to medical cannabis to full legalization for adult use, repealing prohibition entirely. We are so grateful for each of you tuning in today, for all of the legislative leaders that have introduced legislation, the advocates across the state who have gotten us to this point where marijuana law reform is being taken seriously at the Capitol, and as we've seen, is being prioritized by lawmakers. My name is Heather Fazio. I'm the director of Texans for Responsible Marijuana Policy, and I am happy to be joined by my friend and colleague, Jax Finkel, with Texas NORML. Texas NORML is one of our allied organizations. We work with about 25 different groups that span the political spectrum. We're grateful for all of our allies, and Texas NORML has been one of our most active and close partners. In fact, we just finished up the election, of course, everybody knows. We work together on a voter guide. We've done dozens of advocacy training events throughout the state and worked together at the Capitol to advance meaningful marijuana law reform. Jax, do you mind talking just a little bit more about your work?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Heather. I appreciate the introduction and working together with you on this. We've been doing this for quite a few years now, and it's going to be a wild session, so I'm really glad that we have the tight relationship that we do leading up to it. But, you know, Texas NORML, we've been around since 1973 in different iterations, working on the decriminalization that happened then, and then really focusing on making sure we have a good patient program, making sure that we're talking about legalization and all of the different topics that are involved in cannabis policy. And I just wanted to give a shout out to the Legislative Advocacy Workshop that I'll be hosting with the Texas Marijuana Policy Conference coming up. Is it next weekend, the 20th and 21st? It's the time warp, and all of a sudden now it's time. And we are looking forward to also the session starting in January. So I think digging into these bills now, we've already got about 14, 15 bills that have been filed, and last year there were 63. So that's a lot to keep separate, keep track of, and to decide what your priorities are from, but it's going to be very important and exciting. And so thank you for having me join you, Heather.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a pleasure working with you and so many of the folks across the state who are prioritizing this issue, already talking to legislators. You know, just this week, we've already been able to generate hundreds of emails to lawmakers from advocates throughout the state who want to see these laws change. We're so eager for it. Marijuana prohibition has been a failure by every measure. And the least we can do is decriminalize and allow access for patients who need to use medical cannabis. But of course, we want to see marijuana prohibition repealed. So let's get into it. Let's talk about some of the bills that have been filed already. We've got our website here pulled up where we're tracking all of this legislation. If you're interested in checking it out for yourself, go to texasmarijuanapolicy.org/TXMJ21. And that's because this is the 2021 legislative session coming up in January. So let's look at this. Okay, so let's start with decriminalization. The first one here on the list was introduced by Representative Steve Toth. He's introduced a bill to reduce penalties for low-level marijuana possession, 2 ounces or less, which is the lowest category of possession. And you know what I really appreciate about this is while it does make it a Class C misdemeanor, which is still technically criminal, he has included 2 important provisions in this legislation. The first is that it's not arrestable. In Texas, every offense is arrestable with the exception of speeding, open container, texting and driving. And if this legislation passes, low-level marijuana possession would be added to that list. So you wouldn't be arrested. With it being a Class C misdemeanor, it's a $500 fine, but there's no jail time associated. Current penalties have 6 months in jail as one of the penalties that you could face if you're convicted. His legislation also includes a provision relating to driver's license suspension, Because of an agreement we have with the federal government, Texas is required to suspend the licenses of those convicted of drug offenses. This legislation would untangle that agreement and allow us to no longer suspend the licenses of those who are convicted of marijuana possession. Jax, let's go through and talk through some of the other pieces of legislation as well, but let's talk about decriminalization a little bit and it being a priority for y'all.
Sure, absolutely. And also I wanted to say, Heather, I've got the video pulled up on Facebook and there are a few questions in there. So
Great.
Whenever we have the time to get back to that, I would love to. Also, before we move on, Jason Vaughn has said that he has been in contact with Toast Chief and they are open to having more conversations about what other improvements can be made. So I think that's really important. Decriminalization, essentially what it means is reducing the penalties. Of course, we'd like to see the penalties completely removed and have a retail market, but as of right now in Texas, if you're arrested, you could spend up to 180 days in jail. You do lose your driver's license, and there can be a lot of collateral consequences that can affect your grants for school, renting a home, or even your ability to protect yourself with your own firearm. So this is an extremely important conversation and has only become more important as the kind of conundrum with hemp testing has come about. After last session, hemp was legalized, and previously in Texas, you did not have to prove that cannabis was cannabis with a test, but now, because you have to tell from the 10th of a percentage point how much THC to decide if it's legal or illicit, it has come up with a lot of testing issues. And so it's even more important that we stop wasting taxpayer funds on this. We saw from a recent report that a minimum of about $311 million can be saved just by stopping the arrest and prosecution of these low-level offenses, not even getting into the higher-level offenses. And then just real quick, if we can touch on this, Heather, you know, Chair Collier, who is also going to be on the Texas Marijuana Policy Conference next weekend, she recently hosted an interim charge to talk about the hemp bill's implementation and this testing issue. And to that point, she actually authored HB 307, which is a hemp possession protection, which essentially means if you're labeling and you're under the impression that what you're getting is a hemp product, if it were to come back perhaps not within that range, that you would still have that plausible deniability that you thought it was hemp, a legal product. So I think that's going to be an important conversation. But again, like I said, I would like to see all consequences for this removed so that we can actually start working on a retail market, which another speaker from the conference, Joe Moody, has authored a legalization bill. I was wondering, did you want to stick with some of these different decrim options that we have first, Heather, and then pivot to the other topics?
Oh, let's talk about Representative Moody's bill. Go ahead and will you lay out what the bill does?
Sure, I've got some notes here on it because, you know, it is kind of a little bit of a longer bill. Let me just, my highlights that I took away from it was, of course, that here in Texas, you have to be 21 years of age to drink alcohol or to buy tobacco products. So I doubt anyone would be surprised that the retail market for this bill would start with people ages 21 years and older. It would create the whole infrastructure for growing, processing, distributing, retail sales. It also talks about how much can you possess as a person, and you would be able to possess up to 2.5 ounces of flour and 15 grams of concentrates. It also addresses gifting. So the max that you can possess is also the max that you can gift to someone. And really importantly, it includes a ability for people to have their own personal cultivation. We know that people call it home grow, and it's extremely important not only for some therapeutic aspects, but for people who maybe don't have the funds to purchase in the retail market. So it does have different outlines on personal cultivation, and it does explicitly disallow driving while under the influence of cannabis, which I think is important to lay out. But it is of note that in Texas, that driving while under the influence of anything that might intoxicate you where you can no longer drive responsibly is illegal. And so this would continue to be the case. What I also liked seeing was that previous charges for possession do not disqualify you from being licensed from some portion, any part of this program. I know in the ones that we have already enacted, if you have had any criminal history in the last 10 years that can exclude you. And so I think it's extremely important that is in here. There's also a 10% tax rate, and they break down how that will be distributed. So revenues from taxes would go 10% to local municipalities that contain retail establishments, 10% to counties that have retail establishments. There would be 1% that would go to a testing and control fund, which would kind of be the oversight of making sure all of the products are good and all of the regulations are being followed. And then the remainder of the tax revenue would go to public school teachers fund. So it is definitely going to be beneficial for education in Texas to have that happen. And I think that that is a very interesting way to get even more support for this.
And one of the questions we've got on the live stream is, how likely is this to happen? You know, we haven't seen a real big push for legalization before. Certainly not a bill as comprehensive or anything getting as much attention as we've seen this week with Representative Moodys' bill.
I mean, you know, I don't have a crystal ball, and this is going to be a very interesting session, but I think we have a better chance than we ever had before. You know, with the budget deficit that we're facing, it's quite substantial, and we have seen recently that in a biennium, there's an anticipation that there could be $1 billion just in tax revenue and up to another $100 million in licensing fees, not to mention all of the jobs that would also be created through this. So I think in a time where there are economic struggles, people are going to want to make sure that they can cut costs and make sure that the state of Texas is not having to maybe go as stringent on something. So I'm excited. I think it's going to be a very robust conversation. I would not be surprised to see quite a bit of traction on these bills. However, you know, the likelihood of the lieutenant governor perhaps supporting a retail bill is lower than I would like. So I think that might be our pinch point or a hindrance there. So anybody with good connections with the lieutenant governor's office, please make sure that you reach out to him and make sure that he understands how important changing cannabis laws are to Texans.
And one of the tools to help you advocate are reports that are published on the issue. We recently saw a report out of from Vicente Sederberg, which is a law firm in Colorado. They do business in many states, including Texas. And actually, they have several Texans on staff. And it was those individuals that led on this report that we've got pulled up now on the economic benefits of regulating and taxing cannabis in Texas. Now, of course, we want reasonable taxes and reasonable regulation, but we can look at 2 other states to see how Texas can benefit. And what we're seeing, like Jax mentioned, is up to $1.1 billion in tax revenue on this nearly $3 billion a year industry. This could bring in between 20 and 40,000 jobs directly is what they estimate, plus, tens of thousands of indirect jobs with the ancillary companies that serve the cannabis industry. Of course, these economic benefits are on top of the social benefits as well of not criminalizing tens of thousands of people every year, saddling them with criminal records, distracting law enforcement when we all want them focused on real crime, helping to make our communities safer. I think it could also help to bridge the gap and help to reinstill a lot of trust that has been lost between law enforcement and the community. As we've seen, we need to do work on building bridges and building relationships. And I think that, law enforcement getting involved on this, having this conversation could help to build that trust. So this report is available on our website, and we'll be happy to drop a link. Actually, Jax, do you mind dropping a link to the VS report in the comments?
Sure.
So folks can look at that. And also, coming back to our, find the right tab here, Heather.
All the tabs ever, Heather.
Yes. Okay, so back on our tracking bill, I did drop a link to this webpage where we're tracking the legislation. And on the top, it offers you an opportunity to take action. So someone was asking, how do we get involved? Well, we'll talk more about our work that we're going to be doing through the legislative session, although there's a lot of unknowns, like Jax mentioned, in the era of COVID. It's difficult to know how we can participate in person at the Capitol. But what we can do is communicate electronically now through emails. We can send phone calls. We can engage with lawmakers on Twitter. On this page, we have a take action opportunity where you can choose the issue you'd like to communicate with your lawmakers about: decriminalization, medical cannabis, or legalization. And you can send an email to your state senator and your state representative. It is so important that they know that this is a priority for you. They have to hear from their constituents. Otherwise, they can't represent you if they don't know you, if they don't know what you think. So please take time to engage with your lawmakers and ensure that they understand where you stand on the issue. So we jumped from decriminalization to legalization, but I want to come back to decriminalization. So we've got several other pieces of legislation here relating to decriminalizing flower, but we've also got two pieces of legislation, one in the House, one in the Senate, relating to cannabis concentrates. This is so important because current policy says that any amount of a concentrate, a little drop of oil left in a vape pen, or one gummy, is an automatic felony in Texas. And the worst part is that when they're assessing the penalty, they charge you for the entire weight of the product. And some prosecutors have been known to charge people for the weight of the vape cartridge itself, the glass and the metal, even the battery in some cases. Yeah. If you have a brownie, they'll charge you for the entire weight of the brownie rather than cannabis that's in it. So these two pieces of legislation by Representative Canales and Senator Johnson will not only reduce the penalties, but institute a policy of truth and assessment in making them test the product, find out how much cannabis is in it, and then only charge you for that amount. Jax, I know that there are many lawyers that are involved with Texas NORML, and they've been seeing these cases. What have you heard from them about how prosecution is playing out?
So, you know, it kind of varies on jurisdiction is mostly what I hear, you know, from the lawyers here in Austin. As you know, Austin has defunded any testing or arresting for cannabis. So there's really not much movement going on that unless you are transporting large amounts for distribution, because personal amounts are no longer really a problem. But then we see places where people are possessing, let's say, some hemp flower from the store, and the cop doesn't buy it, and they're going to go ahead and cite and arrest them anyways, and then later they have to prove it all out in a court of law. So it has been an interesting thing that has further shown the disparities between the patchwork of policies here in Texas. And I think it just gives further reason for why we need to standardize this, because there's 254 counties in Texas, and it's hard enough to keep track of what the laws are between the states. So when people are traveling, whether they're Texan or tourists visiting, how are they supposed to keep track of these policies between counties? So I think it's a good idea for us to standardize this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So let's shift gears to medical cannabis. As we know, the compassionate use program was established in 2015 for those with intractable epilepsy, allowing access to only low THC cannabis at 0.5% THC. Last legislative session, we were successful in expanding the program, but we still see so many patients left behind. Jess, can you talk about this current status of the program and maybe what some of these pieces of legislation will do?
Sure. So the current Texas Compassionate Use Program is arguably very limited. In fact, some maps of the country don't even show us as having a medical program, which is extremely disappointing. Essentially, here in Texas, you have access to 0.5% THC. And as you'll note, hemp products, which are legal, are 0.3%. So there's a difference there, but not a substantial one. There's about 8 to 12 conditions on the list, but one of the big conditions, intractable neurodegenerative disorder, has something like 200 plus conditions under it. So it has made it a little bit more robust through that definition. But there are 3 licensees here in Texas that can grow, process, and distribute medical cannabis. And they are doing some delivery across the state to make sure that despite the pandemic, the patients are still able to participate. However, we see it's kind of a small patient group. I think it was about 2,500, please correct me if I'm wrong on that, patients that are enrolled in the program, and that is very low. And that is mostly because of the limitations on who can use it and the THC cap, because many conditions need different varying ratios of cannabinoids. So it does kind of tie doctors' hands. And one of my favorite bills that have come out so far is actually out of the Senate from Senator Jose Menendez. He has been a long time advocate of a comprehensive, fully inclusive program. And looking at the bill, I just wanted to highlight a few things that would be improvements from the current situation. So it would create independent testing. If you aren't aware, currently the licensees test their own medical products. Now, I have no reason to believe that their testing isn't accurate, but as the program continues to grow, it's going to be important that this third-party testing is there to make sure that there is consumer and patient protections. It also removes all of the low THC verbiage and replaces it with medical. And the way that I view that is it would basically allow doctors to decide the cannabinoid ratios that you need for your particular condition. It also outlines an extensive and expanded list of conditions and allows for reciprocity. If you're not familiar with reciprocity, it means if you are a patient in Arizona, then you can come to Texas and you can still access medical cannabis here, which is extremely important for patients who travel, who visit family, etc. There's also been this ability for only physicians, specialized physicians, to prescribe this, but they would actually allow it to now be medical practitioners. It would also allow to protect parental rights. Some people are fearful of using it and perhaps getting entangled with CPS, and so this would explicitly protect people. It would also allow for home cultivation for registered patients, which is, as we mentioned before, extremely important. It also changes the prescription language to recommends. We've talked about this for a long time. In America, cannabis is a Schedule I drug, and you cannot legally prescribe a Schedule I drug, but you can make recommendations, and there are some legal rulings as to why that is the case, and we have heard from some doctors that the prescription language is a barrier for them wanting to participate. And just to expand on the medical practitioner part, I wanted to note that it was physicians, physicians' assistants, and registered nurses that were expressly laid out in there. And I did note that there would be some significant fee reduction for licensees. So those were the big takeaways that I got from that bill. Was there anything that I missed, Heather, that you would like to add?
No, I think Senator Menendez does a really great job of addressing the issues that we have with the compassionate use program, the opportunities for making it more inclusive and helping it to operate more efficiently. He's going to be a speaker at the Texas Marijuana Policy Conference next week, and he's on a panel discussing patient protections. He cares about this issue deeply, and I'm so grateful for his leadership. He's joined by Chase Bearden of the Coalition of Texans with Disabilities, as well as, you mentioned, parental rights. This is so important, and Krista McIntyre is a CPS consultant, and she shares her perspective on how this issue comes up when it comes to parental rights and what parents should know, and the need for having legislative oversight and laws in place that protect parents. We also have Rachel Malone. You mentioned gun rights earlier. Rachel Malone is with Gun Owners of America and cares deeply about, the intersection of gun rights and cannabis. Laws now prevents people from purchasing guns legally if they're using medical cannabis, even if it's legal within their state. So, we have a lot of work to do, y'all, in many different aspects at the state and the federal level. And so again, grateful for Senator Menendez's leadership and looking forward to working with him this legislative session. So we do see two other medical related bills introduced, both in the House. We see Representative Reynolds and Representative Dominguez having introduced legislation to expand the compassionate use program. And I want to go ahead and shift gears, and let's talk about the constitutional amendments. There's a lot of question about this and confusion, rightfully so. Most states, citizens can collect signatures and place a question on the ballot for a referendum where the citizens get to vote on an issue, particularly medical cannabis or cannabis in general. We just saw on Election Day, 5 states amend their state law for legalizing adult use entirely, and Mississippi legalizing medical cannabis. So we're officially behind Mississippi, Arkansas, Oklahoma. Come on. We have to do better. And so the question is, why hasn't Texas been able to vote on this? And so the answer is that we don't have citizen-initiated ballot proposals. We have to go through our legislature. Now, there is an opportunity to place a question on the ballot as a constitutional amendment. Jax, will you talk us through what that process looks like?
Sure. So a constitutional amendment goes through a very similar process as a bill does. But what I want to be really clear on is, while it is kind of like a ballot initiative, it's not citizen driven. Ballot initiatives is where you collect signatures to get something on the ballot. Texas is one of over 20 states that do not participate in that. So the way that it works is a legislator crafts the joint resolution. The joint resolution will need to pass the same way as a bill out of both chambers, but instead of having to pass with a majority, it must pass with a super majority. And then at that point, it skips the governor and goes straight to the Secretary of State and will show up on the following election cycle. Now, through that time from when it's passed to when the election day is, it's about 18 months, and it's going to be a lot of marketing, a lot of advertising. Expect law enforcement and all these people to come out for and against, and it's going to be a big conversation. Usually quite a bit of funds are spent. We see in some states millions of dollars are spent on these initiatives to make sure that they do pass. So assuming it passes, then that would come back to the legislature in the following cycle for them to institute statutes around. And then after that legislative session, it would be sent to the different regulatory agencies for oversight and regulations to be drafted up. And then at that point, we would have a program. So joint resolutions are an important way to change our constitution here in Texas, but it is rather cumbersome and more lengthy and expensive than a bill process. So if you are interested in helping gain ballot initiative here in Texas, there are some groups that I encourage you to look into, but that just kind of gives a little overview of the difference between a joint resolution and a regular bill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've seen multiple constitutional amendment proposals, so multiple resolutions put forward by Democrats and Republicans relating to legalization and medical cannabis. So as you mentioned, it is a cumbersome process, but it is an option. And we've seen lawmakers talking about it here. Of course, if we can pass something with a supermajority, I think we can just pass legislation that would become enacted immediately rather than it being a 5-year process. And so that's why we're so grateful to see all of these pieces of legislation, lots of opportunity for a conversation. So I want to see, are there any other questions in the comments, Jax, that maybe we could address? Or if you have any questions, you're tuning in now, go ahead and leave them in the comments and we will try to address them. We've also dropped some links to resources for finding out what bills have been introduced, action you can take to get involved. One thing, so Jax mentioned the Texas Marijuana Policy Conference that we're hosting next weekend, which is really exciting. But we also, on the very first day of session, we're going to be hosting a legislative advocacy workshop. The rules for advocacy at the Capitol this coming session are still up in the air. Because of COVID, it's very difficult to say how we're going to be able to advocate. Will we be able to get into the building? Will we be able to visit legislative offices? How are committee hearings going to be handled? Still lots of questions. So we're waiting to do our usual training. We usually do it a little earlier in January, but we're waiting until the first day, opening day of session, to let everyone know exactly how they can get involved. So we'll be doing that January 12th. Make sure that you go ahead and get registered. It's a free event that we're doing open for everybody.
And Heather, I just wanted to add on to that while some people are dropping questions down in here. So in the House, there's going to be an election of a new speaker. And before Election Day, we saw a lot of people filing, but it does seem like Chairman Dade Phelan is kind of rising to the top as who is most likely to be the next speaker. He has really strong bipartisan support, and he has gone ahead and put together a committee of some high-ranking legislators to look at protocols, to look at what we can do for this upcoming session. There's some great people on that committee, and I am very hopeful that they'll come up with a way that can protect those that may be hurt by the pandemic, but also make sure that we can be inclusive and still engaged, because as you know, during the legislative session, it's all about those personal visits, it's all about going to the hearing, and it's going to look greatly different than it does now. And then I just wanted to hit real quick, if you don't mind, Heather, there are a few decrim bills that we haven't really gone into too deeply. Representative Wu has a penalty reduction that would take and reduce an ounce or less from B to C. And then we see Symphonia Thompson, she put out a bill that actually would reduce the possession of flour of 2 ounces or less to a Class C. And then it would also allow for 1 gram of concentrates, instead of being a state jail felony, to be a Class A misdemeanor. So it brings both of those down. And then lastly, Representative Zwiener has put together a penalty reduction bill that would take an ounce or less from B to C, and an ounce and over would still be a Class B. There would be no arrest, and it also allows for a full expunction process, which is something that can be very hard to do here in Texas. So those are some of the other bills that have been filed.
So one of the questions that I see is, do we have any insight on what's likely to pass? Well, this is ours to determine. Nothing is predetermined in life or in the legislature. And so the more work we do now, between now and the beginning of the legislative session, the better off we are going to be, the better positioned we're going to be to pass meaningful legislation. I can say that last session, we made more progress than the one before. Last time with the proposal to reduce penalties for low-level possession, Representative Moodys' bill that eliminated the threat of arrest, jail time, and allowed an opportunity to avoid a conviction for low-level marijuana possession by taking a drug education course. That bill passed with an overwhelming supermajority with bipartisan support. And so we're looking forward to carrying that momentum and working on senators, helping them to understand the issue. What I found is that it's very difficult for lawmakers, once they've sat down, had a meaningful conversation, a professional conversation about these policies, for them to defend the status quo. And so that's where we come in. That's where you come in as a constituent, making sure that they know what the issue is about, the good reasons for supporting reform, and the fact that you and many of their other constituents want to see these policies changed. Anything you'd add, Jax?
I think that's pretty inclusive there, Heather, but I would say, this upcoming session, there's a lot on the table to be discussed. The Texas Department of Agriculture is one of the agencies that is facing sunset. If you're not familiar, sunset is where every 12 years an agency is either renewed or rejected and no longer around. So that's going to be interesting to see that sunset process. There's also going to be redistricting, which is usually a fairly, I hate to use the word, but contentious process. Then we've got the budget shortfall to deal with as well, and the election of the speaker. So there's a lot to do, and making sure that people are reaching out to the legislators right now is going to be really important, because we know already they're very, very busy. And so it's going to be a lot of work for us. But I did see another question here, Heather, about what stance does the new presidential administration have? So currently, President-elect is President Biden and Vice President Harris, and they have made promises to decriminalize at the federal level and to take other actions and try to help the MORE Act proceed and all of that. So that is what they have said, but we'll have to wait and see as they start laying out more plans what is included. I think that they laid out a racial disparity plan recently, and cannabis or the drug war was not mentioned in it. So I think it's something where we're going to have to continue to have these conversations with our federal legislators as well, and push and promote the issue on that end.
Yeah. I think a lot of people might be under the understanding or thought that because Democrats are now going to be in office, presumably, that this should slide right through. But we have to understand that Democrats and Republicans have worked together to institute and maintain prohibition over the decades. And that includes the two people that are presumed to be going into the White House. So let's make sure that we give them space to evolve on the issue, making sure that we're clear that it's okay for people to change their mind. And that's a good thing. But we have to make sure we hold them accountable to the campaign promises that they made over the last year. Talking about decriminalizing, that is really important. What we need to do is remove federal prohibition and allow the states to make their own decisions. Jax mentioned the MORE Act, which is really important. It has a lot of important provisions in it. I know that the States Act is something else, another proposal that would allow the states to decide their own regulations. And at the Texas Marijuana Policy Conference next week, we're going to have people from NORML, the National Cannabis Industry Association, VS Strategies, and the Marijuana Policy Project giving us a federal forecast. What does it mean now that we have a new administration? What does it look like in Congress? What is the likelihood of these bills passing? What's even on the table? We'll be talking about that and more at the conference next weekend.
I am going to go ahead and put a link to that conference in the comments here. So you can check out all of the different speakers, the agenda. And Heather, can you tell me, I know that it's going to be a 2-day event. If people maybe can't watch on Saturday, are they going to be able to watch a replay at a later date? How's that going to work?
Well, this is the first time we've done a virtual conference. For the last 2 years, they've been in person and they've been great events. And we've had to adjust just like everyone. And so we're hosting it virtually this year, which allows you to attend next weekend and or access the content on demand later. In fact, everybody who registers for the conference will have access to it for 6 months. So you'll be able to process and utilize this information as we move forward and through the legislative session. I've pulled up the website here so we can take a look at the agenda real quick. It starts next Friday. It's so fast. It's been the end of November, that's so far away. And then bam, here it is happening next week. And we are so grateful for all of our wonderful speakers. As Jax mentioned, she's going to be offering a workshop on legislative advocacy. We'll also have a workshop on expungement. If you have an arrest record or even a conviction and you want to get that sealed, Kyle Holscher is an attorney from Corpus Christi who's been a huge advocate for reform. He's going to be hosting a workshop to help talk you through the process and filing the paperwork to get it expunged. It's kind of simple, but also feels really complicated if you're not used to the legal system, which, it's difficult for all of us, but he does a great job of talking through that process. We've also got a workshop on responsible cannabis consumption by Nisha Whiteley. We'll have a demo on cannabis and skincare and a cooking with cannabis demo as well. There's a video from Kitchen Toke, and they were generous enough to share a video of a dinner they recently hosted with Jim Belushi. And he is a riot. And it's a really interesting conversation about, number one, cooking with cannabis, because they're cooking dinner as they're doing it. And so we're learning about cannabis and his journey into getting involved as well. But we've got nearly a dozen elected officials participating at the state and federal level, senators and representatives, industry leaders, advocates, all coming to talk about the various issues relating to cannabis. We'll have Cannabis 101. We'll talk about the rules and regulations of hemp. We'll talk about what we can learn from other states as well. I've got the agenda here pulled up. I think it's too much to go through in detail, but we did drop the link there so you can see the agenda. We'll be hearing from 2 of the licensed companies in Texas that are operating under the Compassionate Use Program. Morris Denton is the CEO of Compassionate Cultivation, and Marcus Ruark is the president of Certera, Texas. There is a third licensed business, Fluent, but we haven't heard a whole lot from them. And so we're grateful to have the 2 that are most active and operating in the state participating in this conference. And they've both actually sponsored the event. So we're real grateful for their support as well. So visit the website, go ahead and get registered for next week. Make sure your friends know. One thing I do want to know, since we've got Texas NORML on the call here, there's a Texas NORML discount code. What is it, TXN20?
Yep.
TXN20 will get you 20% off. And if you have a team of folks that you want to register, we're offering a deep discount for teams. So if you register 4 or more, you'll get even a deeper discount. So definitely check out our agenda, go ahead and get registered, and join us next week for the Texas Marijuana Policy Conference. What else should we cover, Jax?
Well, real quick, I have a question here in the comments from Lisa. Lisa wants to know, when is the deadline for reps to solidify procedures for visiting the Capitol in person? Do we know yet? You know, that would be great to know, wouldn't it? Considering it has been a pandemic since March. I feel like there's been plenty of time to address it and to make it work and function for the interim hearings, which have had some struggles due to this, but I don't know of a deadline in particular. Sooner, of course, is better than later. Have you heard anything about a deadline they might have to provide that by, Heather?
No, there isn't a deadline. But once the legislature convenes, then on the first day of session, first or second day of session, they will address their rules. And that's where they will institute the rules relating to it. Now, there's a chance that they build consensus before that time. And the presumed speaker, Dade Phelan, would announce the expected rules. But we have only been hearing really kind of rumors and ideas about how they'll participate. And so nothing is solidified. We should know as soon as the session begins. And so hopefully we know on January 12th for that advocacy workshop, and we can let everyone know what the rules are for getting in, the rules for once you make it in, how you can operate, how to share testimony, and also how to do so if you're not able to, because a lot of people aren't going to be able to take the risk. Even if they do allow us into the building, you know, we work with a lot of patients and caregivers that are medically compromised and can't afford to take the risk of going to a building where there are hundreds or thousands of people. So we're going to be working to offer opportunities for digital advocacy so that everyone can participate.
Awesome. And, you know, I went ahead and I dropped a link in there, Heather, to a patient tutorial that's happening next week. It's a free tutorial. It's going to be airing on the 18th at noon, but again, will be available for replay on demand if you can't make that time. And we're going to have one of the same doctors that's going to be at your conference, Dr. Allison Kendrick. She's a Texas compassionate use physician. She's going to walk us through the process of what it looks like to become a patient. So that will be really important to help patients gain access. And then once we get more conditions and more cannabinoid access, that'll be important too. And so if you want to register, it is free. And we'll also have some information about the new formulations and uptake methods that both Surterra and Compassionate Cultivation have available. I think one recently did, was it a lozenge for one and like an inhaler for the other? I can't remember off the top of my head, but I am looking forward to hosting that and us being able to get patients ready to participate in the program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Surterra is actually, and Compassionate maybe also, but Surterra has some lotions, which are helpful for those who are suffering from spasticity. And that's why they're in the program. They can put it directly onto the muscles that they're having these muscle spasms in. And that has been helping a lot of folks, people that are suffering from MS or other conditions that cause spasticity. So it's wonderful to see, you know, the innovation that can come when we have a legal market, when they're able to operate in the light of day and do research and development, find ways to get patients access to this medicine. So that is wonderful. Thanks for sharing that information. She dropped a link in the comments for that tutorial. If you think you or a loved one could benefit from cannabis, Dr. Kendrick will be giving you the lowdown on exactly how to participate. Any final comments, Jax?
So just one final question, I think. Twyla is wondering about meetings, wanting to have some meetings in the Bryan College Station area. Are there any coming up? So a lot of people are doing things remotely. So for example, Texas NORML, we're going to have our monthly meeting on the first Wednesday of every month. So December 2nd is our next one. We'll be talking about pre-filed bills. We'll be talking about updated arrest data from Texas and what kind of actions we'll be looking at for the legislative session. So I encourage you to get involved on each of the event pages for Heather, for Texas NORML, for Foundation for Informed Texas, other organizations, and make sure you're going to all of those online opportunities to help get you prepared. And I would say the number one thing that I would invite you to view is recently Heather and I put together a Texas marijuana advocacy workshop, and you can watch that online and then look at all of the different clicks, links, all this good stuff, and that will really help you get prepared, because sadly, Heather and I are not doing the great tour of the state of Texas this fall like we normally do in advance of the legislative session. So that is going to be the way that you're going to be able to get ready and up to date for the next session.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining me, Jax. It's always a pleasure to work with you, and looking forward to the upcoming legislative session. We have a lot of work to do, and it's a good thing we've got a great team all throughout the states of the different organizations and individuals. So check out the links that we've got in the comments. Feel free to reach out to us if you have questions. Stay active and engaged. Contact your legislators at least once before the legislative session begins. And with that, I'll wish you a great day. Talk to y'all next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.